here, but I know quite a few people. And I'm Larry Barlow. My wife, Sandy, is in here with me. Sandy is my consulting co-presenter, even though she doesn't quite feel like it tonight. But she was on the board for 6 years and chaired the board for a year. So she may be, we may get some information from her about this issue of medical errors. So let me share my screen here. Okay. Whoops, is this the one we want? It's the other one. I think it's the other one. Hold on one second. Okay, we'll use this one.
That's what happens when you present this so many times. It's which version?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Okay. All right, so let me get it to the right look here. There we go. So yeah, this is not the right version. Let me do the other one real quick. Sorry.
The perils of so
technology.
Yeah. So Lexus, are you going to come on camera for us tonight? There she is.
There we go. That's the one I wanted.
That's good.
Visually
All right.
prepared to come on camera today. I'm
Okay.
in my pajamas.
So tell me, first of all, other than this being required, tell me what you would hope to gain from this conversation about medical errors. Anybody speak up?
I always like to, just for not only for myself and my practice, but how I can help my supervisees.
That's a good, yeah.
Yeah, I'm kind of curious as to a little bit similar what Stacy's saying, but what are some of the new hazards with medical errors, with interns, and what's, it's always trending and changing, and I haven't taken what this is for my supervisor, and I haven't taken this one for a while, so. And I think the last time I took it, it may have been like one of those, like, how not to cut off the wrong arm kind of one. It wasn't a
right
one that would really actually help me as a counselor.
That's how it originated. Yeah, and I'm gonna talk about that. That's exactly how it originated.
Well, I also know that as a professional that I can be a subpar therapist, but if I have subpar documentation, that's what's going to get my license taken.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay.
I think after you've been practicing a while, like some of us, it's easy to get sloppy.
Okay.
And you get a little overconfident, you get a little sloppy sometimes. And these things kind of jerk me up short where it reminds me, be careful.
Yeah, there used to be a guy who presented every year at AAMT. His name was Ben Caldwell. He is, I don't know if he's still in practice, but he's a California attorney, very prominent attorney in the area of malpractice. And I always go, he's a very good presenter. And I'd go in his workshop and I'd walk away saying, oh my gosh, I've got to go sell vacuums or something because it's too dangerous to do this. He would talk about some of the most outlandish reasons that people get sued and scare the bejeebies out of you,
Well, I don't want to have the bejeebies scared out of me, but I do.
Right.
I'd like the reminder.
Yes.
Larry, the other one that I would add would be implications for telehealth delivery. Is there anything kind of sitting in medical errors in which telehealth, if you're delivering via telehealth, you could screw up easier or?
Yeah, that's a good one, and that is something that we've come into play with since the pandemic started, when pretty much all of us went to virtual therapy. And then now I think a lot of people are hybrid, like I am. I did a virtual today, and and so yeah, I think that is a consideration for sure. Thank you, Richard. Anybody else? So this is what the board wants us to be sure that we cover. They have the guidelines for these required workshops. And so these are things for sure that we'll talk about in addition to other things. But what are the effects of mental health documentation errors, which is like Annalyn was talking about, on patient or client safety and care? Because we don't think about it. As Meredith said, we could get sloppy and not realize that what we put into a documentation may end up being of harm to our clients in some way, to things that we may not even imagine. And then the second objective is describe competent continuity of care and related documentation practices. So again, documentation. And then identify documentation according to best practices to prevent and correct errors. And here's an example of a behavioral health error. Some of this is about ethics and some of it is about medical errors. So I'd like for you to read over that and tell me what you see were the ethical violations and what do you see that would be the medical errors that this educator counselor made. And some of them may be both. So it's okay if you see an error and you say, well, that was really both medical error and ethics. Yeah, wow. I see that.
Is this a real case?
It was taken from a real case. Yeah, it's not one I know of, but it is an example of a real case. Yeah.
It's always a bummer when you lose your marriage over your stupidity, huh?
All of it's a disaster.
It's a disaster for
It's such a
all three
disaster.
people involved, probably, maybe more than that. So what do you see as an ethics violation? What do you see as a medical error?
Well, it seems like when he failed to refer the student to another professional for treatment was an actual medical error, right? Like he went into, then of course you have the dual relationship piece, which is medical error, right?
Yeah.
He failed to report the student. I mean, that's definitely medical error, being a danger to himself and others. Right. So besides ethical, improperly called his wife, that's both medical and ethical, right? Like, unless we know that his wife was also a counselor, but again, just not right.
Right.
I don't mean to, other people jump in.
Yeah.
You shouldn't be taking the person to their home.
No, you should never take a person to your home. I had a client ask me that one time. We'd been in therapy with 2 or 3 others for a long time. And she said, my prior therapist used to tell me if I ever just felt alone, I could just come to his house with his family and hang out and sleep on the couch until I felt better. And so, can I do that with you? I said, no, we're not going there. So evidently it happens. It happens, you know.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, for me, I can't get past the first sentence
I mean,
of
to me, this
entering
just
into
looks
multiple
like a soap
relationships.
Right, right. So he worked at like, as I remember shortening this vignette, the fuller story was that he worked at like a university, and he worked as a counselor educator. He was not a clinical, it didn't have a clinical job there at the university, but he was a therapist, a licensed therapist. And so, yeah, so what stands out, Annalyn, to you about that?
Oh, that, I mean, there's, I mean, certainly dual relationship. If he's an educator, then he has no, he is, I mean, unless he's counseling for academic purposes, right?
Right,
If
right.
this, but if this is mental health counseling, then absolutely the first thing would have been, you know, what is the student counseling referral to have done, and that would have prevented all the rest of this.
All the rest of that.
Yeah, and he probably should lose his job, because if he can't tell dual relationship as a counselor educator, then how could he possibly be appropriately teaching new counselors?
Yeah, and have you ever had, because I know you've been teaching for many years, have you ever had students who came up and approached you with personal issues and either wanted you to counsel them, or you felt like, oh, maybe I could help them? Have you ever faced that?
Oh, yeah. Many times.
Yeah.
Many times. Yeah. The difference is that I have taken as clients former students that were students, you know, a decade ago.
Yeah.
I have done that. But if they're currently a student, if my current relationship with them is as their teacher or as their academic advisor, absolutely not.
Yeah. Okay, so that gives you an idea there. Here's a second one that's a little different. So this is a therapist who also did adoption work for attorneys and an agency. This was about her work at an agency. So read that one and see what you see as a medical error there. It's a little harder, I think, but I may be wrong.
I don't have any training in this particularly, but it certainly seems like that is certainly not enough interviewing for adoptive parenting. It seems like there must be more criteria than that. Yeah. I mean, it's barely more than adopting a puppy, right?
Right. And this person was qualified from the rest of the story, was qualified to do the work, which is what, you know, we have when we talk about are we qualified to work with clients. It really, the law in Florida leaves it up to us quite a bit. There's some things that it doesn't. You know, I don't have the, 100 hours of hypnosis training to say I do hypnotherapy. I don't have the workshops, the training and the supervision to say I'll work with youth sexual offenders, you know. So there's some things like that, but a lot of things it just says if you're competent to do it, then you can do that, right? There's a lot of leeway, and she was competent to do the work and did do the work for many years. This was a case that went bad, unfortunately. So any medical errors you see there?
I'm not that familiar with private home studies. I work in the child welfare field. but
Okay.
I'd be wondering about how she gives approval. That's concerning. I mean, she can give information about the context and her observations of the interviews, but I would want to know what how she was able to approve. I don't know that's within her scope.
Yeah, that's probably a good point. The counselor approved the couple. I happen to do a lot of family law work, and I've had a lot of training for that and do testify in court quite a bit. There are times that I go in as a therapist, and as a therapist, I'm an expert, but I'm only an expert on the counseling. I'm not a court-appointed expert to give any opinions about like a divorce and child custody or anything like that. And I have, even with the judges sometimes, I have to set that line and say, yes, that's not my role here. I can tell you, as a therapist, I met with these family this many times, and basically here's what we did. You know, once the release is given, the release for information. And frequently I've had attorneys and judges say, but we know you do this and we're sure you have an opinion. And it's amazing to me that I do see people who are not, they don't do family law work, they don't have the training, and they'll write letters to judges giving an opinion, right? And that is a medical error to me. In fact, it's in the law and you can get yourself into some pretty bad trouble with that. So yeah, the word approved, I don't know if that was a big deal or not. And it is a tragic case because, yeah, her job may have been just to do the home study and give that information. And then after the egregious abuse and neglect, and the one child even dying who was adopted, the lawsuit came back. And of course, they come back for everybody. You know, it's the big pockets. So they go after everybody they can. And this is a case when actually if you saw more of the story, the malpractice insurance decided, hey, we're just going to pay. And it was a 6-figure payout. This is like more than 10 years ago, a 6-figure payout. So it really wasn't up to her and to settle the lawsuit, because sometimes they look at it and see, you know, how risky is this for the company, that sort of thing. So, yeah.
Yeah.
So here's some things that we might think of as medical errors. Any thoughts or questions on these? If you've ever had a patient suicide, do you go back and process that? Do you consult about it? You know, what do you do? Anybody have any input you want to give there?
I'm happy to say that's never happened.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it would be a practice error that if you knew a client was at risk, that you didn't
Right.
start calling in all sorts of
Right.
other
Right.
supports, the family, psychiatrist, you know, all of those folks. I think that would be a practice error. And then to document everybody you tried to contact, document
Right.
the
Right.
release of information, the context to all of those parties, the documentation of all the effort you went to. I think that would be the medical documentation aspect of client suicide.
Yeah. Yeah, I've had one case while I was actively seeing a client this was a number of years ago. And then I've had two others that I know of that was years after I saw them. So it wasn't while they were in treatment with me. In the case when I was in treatment, I only saw the individual one time, and I referred him to a psychiatrist and found out later that he did go to the psychiatrist. He no-showed for the second appointment, which was like 3 days later. And I called and he didn't answer. And I called the emergency contact. That person didn't answer. I left a message, and about a day after I called, I was called and found out that he had killed himself, unfortunately. And what I did was I made an appointment with an attorney that handles a lot of therapy cases and went through my record and document, what I documented and everything, and put in there what I got. And I never was contacted, never had any issue with it, but it was scary for sure. I mean, it was tragic. This was a very bright young person who had all the potential in the world, unfortunately, but had a huge psychiatric long-term illness and family history, which he actually lied about to me in the history taken, and said he had never been hospitalized, never attempted suicide.
Right.
Never.
So yeah. So how do you protect yourself documentation wise that way, which is to say upon direct inquiry
Right,
regarding, right. So you document that you asked,
right,
and that the client said no. And that's another reason to always try to see families.
right,
If
right.
someone else in the family will, oh no, what about the time? Yeah. So yeah.
I wanted to say, this idea of seeking supervision or outside look at your documentation. I had a similar thing that you're talking about, Larry, in which one of my clients committed suicide. And it was interesting in terms of, so the first thing I did was go to the clinical director and say, take a look at my chart and give me some feedback. And then we decided to submit it to, we had an in-house quality control. That is randomly, 5 cases get reviewed per month or whatever it is. And I just basically said, we're not going to make this a random one for this case. I want it reviewed by the review committee or whatever it is that it is. What I found to be the difficulty with that was, how do I say this? Back ending the documentation. That is, when my supervisor reviewed it, this was a case that I'd been working with for 3 or 4 years. So you can imagine the significant amount of documentation.
Right.
The agency typically reviewed cases. This case had been reviewed 3 times by this quality, review committee or whatever it is. However, when the supervisor looked at it under this suicide issue, it was sort of like, I don't know, within the course of all the work, there were probably 3 sessions that she said to me, you really could tighten up the wording on such and such a session. You really could make that wording a little bit more clear in terms of the way you handled, what went on. And that discussion, and we ended up, sort of bringing it into the full practice for discussion. That issue in and of itself was a struggle for everybody in the room. And you can imagine why. And it is, you want me to rewrite a case note from, 6 months ago,
Right,
3
right.
years ago, whatever it is that it is, or you want me to rewrite a summary that minimizes, something that
Oh, yeah.
failed to do, 6 months earlier or 9 months earlier or whatever it was
Mhm.
there. And basically, we left the documentation alone, but nothing happened to the documentation. Whatever I
Yeah.
wrote is what I wrote.
Yeah.
And that was the end of the story. But I did find, and everyone in the staff basically went through this whole sort of, self-reflection about
Mhm.
what happens when our cases are inadequately reviewed, if that's the way you want to look at that. Or what happens if, under normal circumstances, we'll let this documentation go as is, but when it's stress, we'll look at the documentation in a different kind of way. When the stakes are higher, that is suicide. Or in this case, there was a daughter who, a prominent politician in the community who was the daughter of this individual. And so it raised the profile of the agency, it raised my profile, it raised the director's profile, it created all this political kind of stuff that was there. But it was really interesting to kind of, go through this whole, I don't mean to, spend too much time on it, but to go through the whole idea of documentation review, somebody signing off on and saying that was a good chart, somebody reviewing the chart and blah, 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 and all that, and how that looks under normal conditions and how it looks under high risk or stressful conditions or whatever. And I just throw that out for,
No,
anybody
that's-
who's had a similar kind of thing happen, or any
Yeah.
kind of comments anybody wants to make.
Thank you, Richard. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, I've never had a client who's committed suicide, but I've had suicidal clients, and I want to put a plug in for, I think his name's Dr. Barry Jacobson. He has a book and he does trainings on how to deal with suicide, and he whole treatment way of what you do with the client, how you document. He also does trainings on documentation. His wife is an attorney. So I found, and Douglas Flemings also has a similar book.
Mhm.
I have both books, and I found going to the training and reading both books to be made me feel a little more confident about what to do and how
Good,
to,
good.
and I do the old thing where I'll go and sit with the person and we write everything down together. They leave with the cards with everything. I'm calling numbers. They have to call me, and if they don't call me, they know I'm
Mhm. Mhm.
calling a welfare check. And so there's lots of things that you can do, and you document all this and it tells you step by step. So just want to, because it can
That's
be
good.
scary of what to do and how to document. And so there are some experts out there, Dr. Jackson and Dr. Douglas Flemings as well.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Yeah, Doug Flemings, some of us know Doug from being a Nova Southeastern retired faculty now and MFT program. And Doug did do a lot of research, including this Golden Gate Bridge, I believe, was some of the research he did of the people who jumped off the Golden Gate Bridge. And he has a relational model, which I would really like, but I like what you shared there because I think that addresses Stacy's question of us mentoring other people, interns or whatever, and guiding them into it. Just great information, just like you just brought up there. I think that's just excellent. Yeah.
Cynthia, could you put into chat the author's name, and then one of our folks, I'm sure, can go look for it in Amazon and give us the title of the book.
Okay. Good.
Thanks,
Yeah,
Cynthia.
Thank you.
Larry, I'll throw out a resource as well. I've had two patients over the course of practicing that have suicided. One when I was a resident, and I didn't know it until the psychiatrist himself called me to tell me that he had found that. And then one not too long ago by gunshot.
Mm.
And I was notified by the husband. So one of the things that has been helpful to me is I found a workshop on dealing with patients with chronic suicidality
Oh,
that
okay.
has been done by I forgot, what are the people in Houston?
Oh, are you talking about the collaborative therapy place?
No, I'm thinking about the
Robert Beaver, is that it?
No, hospital that used to be, I just blanked completely, but
Mhm.
that used to be in Miniger.
Oh,
Miniger
Miniger
Clinic did a really fine
Okay,
workshop on that for
Okay,
3 or
good,
4
good,
hours.
good.
That was an excellent resource that has been
Okay.
helpful to me.
good, thank you. Yeah, that's one way we can help each other, especially for those of us who do private practice and we're not in a group, necessarily to get information to do things like this, I think is quite helpful. These are just some of the ones that I consider to be high risk clients when they walk in the door. And in fact, one of my interns, currently interns not for licensure, but at Capella University, in the very first week that she saw clients, she had a case come in where there was some domestic violence, and she asked the agency, what are your procedures, what are your policies? And they said, we don't have any. And so that's unfortunately not very helpful. That could have been very dangerous for her. We got her some information and kind of helped guide her along the way, because there are some evidence-based materials out there on domestic violence. I'll put in the chat here. Sandra Stith. Hope I spelled that right. She used to be at Virginia Tech, and she, along with others, did some evidence-based work on working in domestic violence field, and it's excellent. She has a book on Amazon working with couples, so where there is domestic violence. Are there other clients that you would consider adding to this list? The type of client that I don't have up here, I'm sure there are others.
I would-
Eating
I would add,
disorders.
Eating disorders, yeah, that could go under harm to others, harm to self. Could have put self there, but eating disorders for sure.
the other one I would add is sort of highly medicated clients.
Highly medicated, thank you. Besides these on the slide, are
I
there
would
other
say
high risk clients?
people in pain.
People in pain, physical pain you're talking about.
Yeah.
Adam,
Yeah, untreated physical pain.
yeah.
Trying to get pain management and not being able to get pain management. I mean,
Yeah.
I've had a lot of people that I've been very concerned that they're going to kill themselves because of, some of the
Right.
restrictions with getting pain medicine.
Yeah. One
so-
of my clients this week, elderly client, said
Mhm.
the neurologist he goes to said, we can't really do anything to fix this, so we're just going to rely on medication. And he was not happy with that answer. And that's tough. That's tough. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah. My own my stepfather attempted suicide
Oh, okay.
after tons of things that happened in his life, survived World War II in Europe, fought all
Yeah.
sorts of things, and then ended up in a lot of chronic pain and couldn't get, got charted that he was pain medication seeking.
Mhm.
and ended up in a severe amount of pain. It was a real difficult time to
Yeah, that's,
go through for him and his you know, my mom and everything.
yeah.
But I
What-
see it also in my practice.
One group that I don't have up here that I think about is the case where clients have been married, have children, and they're about to separate. That's what Sandy was about to share, because we know that the time of separation are those high risk times when things can get explosive. But one of our colleagues, our former colleagues, who's not here in Tallahassee anymore, but she unfortunately had 2 cases where the one spouse shot the other and then killed himself.
Mhm.
2 of those cases. And it was it was at that time, that high stress time. And okay. So let's move on here. So I'm not going to do this video, we'll pass that. So this is a study, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but this was something I came across a number of years ago at an AMFT conference. And the insurance company who sold the professional liability had done a long-term study there, almost 10 years. And they kind of grouped together what were the cases where claims were paid for either ethical or medical errors. And they found that over half the claims occurred in an office-based setting versus like somebody living in a group facility or psychiatric hospital or something like that. Most professional liability claims involve face-to-face counseling of an individual client versus a couple or a family. And I think, Richard, your question here, nowadays, I'm waiting to see the research that comes out on telehealth here and how this affects things since the pandemic, particularly. And then the inappropriate sexual manic is an ethical thing. And these were some of the reasons, the high reasons that when medical errors were actually paid, these were why the people had sought counseling. Marital discord. So for all of us, 31% of the cases were medical discord. So that goes back to kind of add to that list of maybe we need to consider people who come in for marriage counseling and who are identifying problems. That may be a high risk client when we don't even think of that sometimes.
Well, particularly if we see only an individual.
Yeah, particularly if we only see an individual. Yeah. Family discord, 10%. Depression goes back to what Annette was talking about with pain. This is emotional pain. And alcohol abuse. And this was the study, HPSO is the company. And this just shows the payout. The average paid expense was $176,860. And then besides the lawsuit, then there's also board action to the people. So I don't mean to scare people with that, going back to what we said earlier. So we know these questions, and 2 hours we're going to run out of time. So I don't want to spend a lot of time here, but these are things that are real important to medical errors. What do we put in our informed consent? What are the exceptions to confidentiality? We've talked about a little bit, duty to warn, or duty to notify, testifying in a family case or something like that. That's not a mandated thing. And now, how many of you are aware that 14-year-olds in Florida now have to do their own release if there's going to be court testimony? The parents cannot give a release if you're going to testify about somebody who's 14 or older. So,
Did not know that.
right. So that's a fairly new law.
I'll have to get the statute from you, Larry, so we can.
That's the one that Christine brings up a lot. Remember that they have to give their own release. Yeah, there is an age on it. Yeah, yeah. And I just had a case where that would have been, but they ended up settling, thank goodness. But it was a 13-year-old, but I went ahead and had him sign it if I was going to have to testify, which I would have been. So I was glad that they were able to settle. What is it about informed consent? What are some things that could be medical errors in there? Like I have a statement in my informed consent that in counseling, you may get worse. That may be an outcome.
So it sounds like managing expectations.
Yeah. 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 Acknowledge them at the least, Sandy said, yeah. What else in informed consent? For example, if you're an intern, a registered intern, then do the clients have to know that? Do they have to know who your supervisor is?
Yes.
It's not a
Yes.
qualified supervisor workshop, but absolutely, those are things that must be in informed consent. Yeah, one of my interns asked me about that because Annalyn and I both have people in their first quarter of internship, and she was complaining, if they know that, they won't want to see me. So anything else in informed consent you think of?
I mean, about how they will have to pay for missed sessions or late sessions and how those fees will be collected. I go over like a lot of these things verbally on top of making sure they've
I
read
do
it.
too. I do too.
Signature off
And
everything.
I noted
Yeah.
that I've went over it verbally. Yeah. On such
Right.
as day. Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
I'm writing
Larry,
that.
could you speak to something that seems to come up periodically about a no secrets policy?
So, yeah, that's not in my informed consent, but it is in my, I do inform clients of that if there are going to be occasions that say somebody's sick and the other one comes in, so I see them alone, or on the occasion when somebody will want me to work with them for a session or two, or I'll say, would it be okay for us to talk, say, about anger management or something like that? So that is something that, as I say, it's not in my written form consent, but I do document it. And I tell people I don't keep secrets. And my rationale for that is to say, you know, if I see you over any length of time at all, I'll forget who told me what. So I just put it on me and my memory and say, so there, yeah, I don't do secrets.
How does that bump up against confidentiality?
Well, they're consenting that that's going to be the case, or we're not going to do this separate.
So that would be your fallback, is if they're
Right.
not willing to consent
Consent.
to that you're not going to trust your memory to
Right.
not tell things, then we shouldn't do these individual sessions.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
In my agency, since we do telehealth,
Mhm.
part of it is like our system is, HIPAA compliant, and obviously our offices had to,
Right.
be HIPAA compliant. But we cannot, on their end, they have to be in a secure, safe
Mhm.
place, if to ensure that nobody else is hearing on their end, and that we also do not do telehealth if they're driving.
Yeah. Yeah. That's
Well, we have to say
something.
that because people try.
Yeah, people will do that if you allow it. I've done a lot of telehealth with people in a car, but not them driving. So they pulled off and they're parked and they're secure. Then I'll do that. I don't know if y'all do that or not.
I tell them they have like 10 minutes to rejoin. Once they park and pull over, then it's considered.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
I'm a little bit curious. I know that the confidentiality is that I have to maintain confidentiality.
Mhm.
Client can break their confidentiality any way they like. That's their
Sure,
choice.
it's their
I
privacy.
can. So
Yeah.
this idea of asking them, are they in a secure place? I'm certainly willing to talk about, their choice to be where other people can hear them or to have the door open or about that. But I'm not clear, Tanya, how is it my responsibility
Oh, it's
for
not. It's
them
just
to maintain?
the way we have like informed consent, and if you're doing telehealth, it's an extra informed consent on top of
Right,
that,
right.
and understanding that HIPAA is guaranteed on my end with my computer, with my company phone, but it's not guaranteed. Like what they're doing on their end is their full responsibility.
That's actually in the code of ethics, that we have a duty in the code of ethics that addresses that, and that's the code about technology, that we need to inform people, like if they're doing a cell phone, if they're calling us from a cell phone, even to schedule, that may not be secure. We cannot guarantee that. And if they're around other people, then we can't guarantee their confidentiality. And so I think that's where that comes from there, Ann Lynn.
Yeah, I just want us to be clear that there are limits to what we've got control of. And so having a conversation with the client about their choices, their choice to be on a cell phone, their choice to be where other people can hear, just to have that clear and then document that discussion.
Yeah. So let me move on because of time. These are the mandated reporting in Florida that we know of. Now, HIV/AIDS is actually not a mandated reporting, but I put it on here because in some states it is, but it's not in Florida. In California, for example, the law is different there, as I understand it. And it's a felony to sleep with somebody if you knowingly have HIV or AIDS. In California, that's true, maybe in other states. But child abuse, elder abuse, people who are unable to protect themselves, so people who have some sort of lack of competency and about harm to self or others. Have we missed anything there for mandated reporting? Anybody knows of?
What about court orders from the judge?
Well, that's not a mandated reporting. It's not in that section in chapter 39. It's in a different chapter of the Florida law that's one of the ways. There are three basic ways that people can, that information can be released. And one is a judge's order, not a subpoena. A subpoena doesn't do it, but a judge's order will release confidentiality. Now, you as a therapist can fight that. You can argue with the judge. You can present in one-on-one why you think that shouldn't happen. But, and Sandy's done that in some cases where it would have been a danger to the child in court, for example. One of the other besides the judge's order then is if they release the information and then there's some other government releases, like if somebody has signed an health insurance policy, then Blue Cross has that on file. They can say, hey, we want to review the record. So any insurer, you've already, as a client, you've given them that. There are other cases if you're wanting to be barred get past the bar and become a bar attorney in Florida, you signed that the bar can look up any of your counseling records if they so choose fit. And that's true. Well, if it's not that they give up their right just for seeing me, but they sign when they apply for the bar that they will allow that information, that the bar can do that, and they're supposed to tell them if they were in counseling or not. People who are applying to work for certain agencies like the FBI, for example, the same thing. I've had that happen. So,
Blair, could you speak briefly on this notion of that you document that something happened and you chose not to do a child abuse report or something like that? Or, I mean, seems to me that that could get kind of tricky.
well, it is tricky. Yeah, I put up there that the chapter 39 is the child abuse reporting and the other reporting information. If you want to look it up, it's very complicated. There's all kinds of complications about reporting or not reporting type of things. There are cases that I've called in, and I'm sure for you too, for many of you, and I thought they would take it as abuse, and they didn't. And others that I was surprised that they took, that they did take it as abuse, you know. Can you ask that, Annalyn, in another way? I'm not quite sure what you're asking.
Sure. I mean, so client reports something like harm, threat of harm to someone, but you're not sure to take whether this is an actual threat, right? So documenting that they said something, but that through discussion, determined that it was not a credible threat to someone else. Finding a document the fact that you didn't do a mandatory report is
Right.
kind of what I'm wondering about.
Okay. Yeah. So if you, I mean, what's the law say basically? If you suspect, right? If you suspect child abuse, just to stay on that one, then you're mandated to report it. Neglect or abuse, right? If you suspect it. There are occasions where that's very subjective. And so you may have a case where you know, Sandy has an example. So,
okay, so a parent comes in, they're in divorce, custody battle.
okay.
One parent is very anxious and is certain that the child's being abused at the other parent's house.
Okay.
But there's no evidence at all
Okay.
of any abuse.
So let me repeat that because you probably can't hear it too well.
And you don't have any reason to suspect,
Okay.
except that the parent says.
Yeah. So Sandy's talking about there's a divorce, a divorcing or a divorced parent custody dispute, and one parent comes in swearing to you that the child is experiencing abuse at the other parent's house. There's absolutely no evidence for that, anything that you've observed or had reported legitimately to you other than that one parent. There actually are statistics that 90% of abuse reports in a custody battle are not abuse cases. 90%. And I've had, and I'm sure that anybody that works with a lot of divorce cases, I've had it where it's back to back. Oh, you reported me because you didn't like the way the child was bathed. So I'm going to report you because I didn't like what you fed the kid for breakfast, kind of stuff. And I had cases where there were 10 DCF reports made, So yeah, so in documenting that, then yes, you would document, here's what I was told, here's what I had based on my information, and show your efforts there, that you did take it seriously, and then came to the conclusion that there's no abuse there.
No, you don't
No?
come to the conclusion that.
Well, in your,
You
okay,
don't
she's correcting my
suspect.
word. You don't
You
suspect.
don't have any reason to
Yeah.
suspect that the child is abused other than this parent.
Yeah, that's the better word. Yeah, you've probably heard that. So you don't have any reason to suspect that there's abuse other than this one parent who's saying there is. Yeah. So you would document it that way.
Thanks.
Yeah. So this is the part of the Florida, again, not all of our laws are in 491. There's a lot of laws like Chapter 39. 456 is about all healthcare, all medical care. And so there's a number of things in 456 that we don't find in our chapter, but we fall under it. So to prevent medical errors, if you look at the 491 website and you click on statutes and rules, it'll pull up a list of them. And you can actually look at those and see, well, what rules are out there that we fall under, what statutes are there that we fall under, just like 456. Not all of 456 is about us, but there's certainly things there. So one of my interns recently got in trouble because she was sending an email to a client. She sent it to the wrong client, and it did disclose identifying information about the first client that she thought she was sending it to. So that is definitely a medical error, right? And so based on what we know, other than the agency stepping in, which they did, the supervisor, the owner of the private practice, both stepped in. What steps should you take here?
No, you have to notify the person's information that was breached, for lack of a better word, right? Let them know what happened.
Right, yeah, and that goes back to this. We have a duty to notify anything that might harm the patient, 456, and document that you did that. And hope that that's the end of it. Right. So yeah, this is a time of learning for sure. Any alternative healthcare? What would be alternative healthcare in regard to mental health? What can you think of? There was a time when the EMDR was an alternative healthcare, but now that's not the case because of all the evidence. And so it's kind of, if it were a drug, it would be FDA approved now, right? Can you think of any cases now that are alternative healthcare?
There's all sorts of other kinds of trauma addressing models that are out there. But honestly, Larry, I don't know, there's no body that I'm aware of, like the FDA, that deems something like EMDR as now no longer alternative. We don't have a mechanism like that.
No, we don't.
Yeah, so it would be really hard to say. I mean, I'm sure hypnosis at one time was considered alternative, but there's biofeedback as alternative. And I don't know which of those would now not be considered alternative.
Well, and one of the famous cases that you probably studied was about birthing, where a child actually died in a birthing process.
Yes.
Rebirthing. Yes, rebirthing. Yes, Andy corrected me there. Yeah. Can you think of any others that you know of, per se?
I think I'm confused by this. What does this mean? Like that, like somebody does yoga, or like what do you mean? Complementary alternative?
Let me give you an example. So I had a client who this was involved with, and a licensed healthcare professional mental health care professional, was doing a casting out of demons at her church. And it was under the auspices, it was under it was part of mental health care, and mixing the religion with that. And fortunately, she asked me to attend, and that's the one time I've ever gone to one of those. And I stepped in and said, hey, this is not, I recommend this stop. And it did, fortunately. And the reason for that is because I had already got 2 clients who had been in a similar situation with this same church. And they did have their own counseling center. And they ended up in a psychiatric hospital.
Okay, I understand, yeah, because I've had 2 clients that they left their therapist to work with me, and they actually came from the same person, that the person was telling them that they had bad karma, reincarnation, and that they had to go back and look at their previous past lives.
Yeah, that's a good example. Thank you. Yeah. So, and this is in the law, 456, complementary or alternative healthcare treatments. Now, there's a lot of medical things.
So a documentation, Larry, would be that people have to, this is a part of informed consent, that they would have
This
to.
is part
we
of
would have to
informed consent.
document that we explain that they are consenting, knowing that this
Yeah.
is alternative and it's outside of the conventional treatment.
Exactly.
Gotcha.
Yeah. And so that's basically what this slide is saying. So yeah, part of the law is to tell the patient, and with any medical procedure, you've signed all sorts of things, and we're going to skip the HIV because we don't have time to do that. So title display. We can do LMFT if we're doing promotional materials or whatever. It can be our business cards, brochures, workshops that we're doing, that sort of thing. What about registered interns? Can they do RIMHC or RIMHT?
Nope. They have to spell it out.
They have to spell it out. And why do you think that is? Why is that a rule?
A lot of people don't
Misleading.
understand the abbreviations.
Yes.
Pardon?
A lot of people don't understand the abbreviations.
Yeah, exactly. A lot of people don't understand the LMFT, the LCSW, the LMHC. Those are things that have been around in the law, and I think most people would at least have some idea about what those stand for. But that's a real simple one. So this goes back, Stacy, to what you asked about, teaching our people that we supervise. And I see it frequently if I'm looking for a therapist, and I'd go to Psychology Today, and I'm looking for a therapist in an area, and I'll go down there and I'll say, hey, I know that person. That person's an intern. And it's saying they're a licensed marriage and family therapist.
Oh, wow.
And sometimes they don't even know that. I've called people and they said, oh my gosh, no, I didn't know that's how it was mislisted there. So scope of practice errors, competency and training, we've gone over diagnosing. I didn't know that 10/1, October 1st of this year, they were changing. They got rid of not a lot, but they got rid of some of the diagnosis codes. Did y'all know that? The ICD codes, yeah. Not DSM, but the ICD, which is what we have to use for insurance. And the only reason I knew that is because we have a good company that files for insurance. And they said, hey, this doesn't F43 whatever doesn't, it's gone, it's been retired or whatever. And so that sent me back to search. So, you know, but yeah, what can be the harm of misdiagnosing? Let's talk about that for a couple of minutes.
Wrong treatment.
Wrong treatment. Absolutely. Absolutely. And I've seen that. Actually, I've seen that at the board when I used to go to the regulatory board meetings, and they're open and they're real interesting to go to. And they're now, many of them are virtual, I think, right? Internet.
No, they've gone back to in person, but they do entirely record them, audio record them. And in the minutes, it will show, like if you're interested in a particular issue that they covered, they'll show in the full minutes the timestamp. And so you can go to the recording and listen to the discussion of that issue.
So I've seen it come up in somebody who did get into some trouble, and they're sitting there with the board, and the board, you know, the board members looking at a big thick file of an investigation about whatever it was that came up. But they can actually look at anything that comes up once they open an investigation. So if they could be that they tripped and fell in my hallway, that's the violation that got reported. But if they're pulling out the file and doing interviews, they can look and say, well, Larry did other things wrong too. And so I've seen where they did just what you were saying, and they said, well, you're saying you did this treatment and that treatment, but you told us earlier in the file that this was the diagnosis. Is that really the treatment for that diagnosis? And it wasn't. Can you
I
think
think you
of
could
other?
also fail to make proper referral to psychiatry or medical. You know, client comes in complaining of chest pain, and if I fail to talk about, have you seen your cardiologist? You know,
Right.
And I fail to document that. Yeah.
Right. It's a good point. Yeah. Yeah. And if you want to look at qualifications for practice, then this is the chapter 64B4-7 that gives that in the Florida rules. So if you just Google chapter Florida rules, chapter 64B4-7, it'll pull up a list of things for qualified for practice or not. So more on the scope of practice. And this is what we said earlier, that we can do all these things. And we're fortunate because not every state can diagnose. I remember Texas had a huge lawsuit about MFTs being qualified to diagnose just a few years ago. And fortunately, they won the case. They didn't lose the right to diagnose. But Florida, we can. Not all states, they can't. That comes up periodically. And in terms of diagnose, support your diagnosis in your notes, in your documentation. Why did you do that diagnosis? Review it regularly because things may change. You know, a psychiatrist told me a great story about diagnosing adolescents, but I think it could be used in other examples. So when he was going back to the old Polaroids, you take a picture, and when you see it first, it's just black. And then after a little time, what happens? You see some blurry things. Over time, it finally clears up. And he said, that's the way I look at diagnosing. So in the beginning, when you take that first shot, it may look very dark and blurry. And it may take time to actually clarify what is an accurate diagnosis or not. And some of y'all mentioned already, but do you see that comes up a lot in trauma cases? Where is it trauma, or is it depression, or is it, you know, what is it, borderline personality or trauma? Do you see those kind of things? So, and how would you feel if, like Richard was talking about earlier, everybody reviewed your file and your diagnosis? That's a question that I think we want to ask ourselves. You know, how would I feel about this if somebody else was going to be looking at it? And this is just one example. So if you are going to testify in cases regarding evaluations of minor for the purpose of addressing custody, residence, or violation disputes, and this is in chapter 64, the rules. These are the things that we have to do to qualify us. And there's a number of special cases like this that we would be making a medical error if we didn't do these things. And that's why I said I don't do youth sex offenders, because I've had that, don't want to have that training, don't want to do that, not interested in it. That's just an example. I already talked about that. So let's talk about standards of care. So treatment plans, documentation, record keeping. When you first are trying to put your treatment plan together and you feel like you're that person scratching the head looking at all of those possibilities, what do you use to help guide you? And this is a real question I'm asking for examples from folks.
I usually think of the first step as talking with the client about their goals.
Okay.
Our diagnosis, and then what are the client's goals?
What are the client's goals? Thank you, Laura.
I encourage my students to do a thing that I call the bubble map, which is a circle of bubbles that looks at or identifies each of the things that the client has complained about as a problem, and then put at the center the one that they want to work on first, and then looking at the relationship between all of those as a, or another one, it would be to use an echo map to kind of identify what are the issues that they want to move away and things that they want to move towards.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you. Others?
I think a lot of it depends on what they're telling you. There's some keywords after a while that jump out. And there are a lot of times where I do a collaborative diagnosis with the client. There's no reason they can't see what's in DSM-5. And so we'll pull out DSM-5 if need be and look at that and walk through. Here's this kind of depression. Here's the granddaddy of depression. What do you think fits? And so it helps to do a collaborative approach because they feel included and they have seen the criteria.
Yeah. Thank you, Meredith.
Yeah. I just had this come up with some interns the other day. And, you know, we were talking about they're all outpatient, you know, therapists in private practice, not insured, that they're sane. And the client really wanted to deal with some problem, marital issue, communication, right? But they didn't want to deal with the fact that they drink like 4 or 5 bottles of wine together and every night and have a knockdown, drag out fight once intoxicated, or every major fight follows a big intoxication. So although the client has an idea, like we're here to talk about communication issues,
right.
You know, as a therapist, you have to know that
all couples, right. That's why we're here to talk about communication, right?
Yeah, and or sex, right?
Right.
Somebody wants it more, somebody wants it less, right?
Right.
But yeah, so I think, you know, like remembering that, you know, clinically you have to still know what's the issue. Like it's hard, it's going to be hard to deal with communication issues if every time you have a communication problem, massive amounts of alcohol have been consumed.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm not even sure you can tell me what happened, right? You know. So I think it's balancing that, like, yeah, they have an idea of what they want to look at, and yet also, but we also clinically have to see what is actually going on clinically.
Yeah. Yeah. So for those who do work with interns, One of the things that I find very frustrating is that they'll be at an agency where they're saying, you've got to produce a treatment plan in the first session, right? And I think that's extreme. I mean, they can produce something, but you know, how valid is it going to be 3 or 4 sessions later, kind of thing. So that's one of the issues about time frames. What do we mean by expected outcomes in regard to treatment plans?
For me, it means like that we're going to sit down and evaluate our progress, how far we got with your goals. We're going to be reviewing these from time to time, and I'm going to take note of that in our files. So in 3 or 4 weeks, we'll talk about where we're going and did you get the results?
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, what's reasonable, what's probably not reasonable. There might be some things that can change, some things won't.
Right.
You know,
How do we know how you know, to work with a client? How will we all know that you've gotten what you came here for?
right. Yeah, right. Exactly. That's a great question to pose. Like, you know, so checking back in. I think that's a good one.
My virtual client today, I think he's 38 years old, and he said to me, you know, having a therapist is like me taking my car to the shop, and if they don't fix the problem, then I need to change therapists. and I said, that's great. so, you know, it is a consumer-driven process, isn't it?
I think also, is it solution focused that basically puts the client in the position of, if we worked on this for the next 2 or 3 months, can you tell me how the world's going to be looking? You know,
Yeah,
in
the
2 or 3
miracle
months?
question. Yeah.
Yeah, what are you going to be feeling? What are you going to be thinking? What are you going to be doing? And I think that is also a kind of helpful way of, you know, thinking through that goal setting and goal review kind of thing.
Right.
You said you would be drinking less, or you said
Mm-hmm.
you wouldn't be, you know, waking up in the middle of the night with nightmares. Or did you have a lot of bad dreams this week, or did you not? You know, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Trying to
Yeah.
anchor it in something that they set up as some kind of expectation for growth. However
Yeah.
they're defining that.
Yeah. Thank you, Richard. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Just also if the client is doing the work, because I mean,
Right.
if you talk about all the coping skills, communication skills, like you were saying that your client could just
Mhm.
trade you out like a mechanic, but if you keep just not utilizing anything, that's
Right. Yeah.
what
The
can we
therapy
do?
is not going to, they're not going to get the outcome that maybe they set out to get. And that is part of what we have to team up with them about. Yeah.
Yeah, and I review that
Document.
I'm like, it doesn't seem like you're actually motivated to work on these things. What's getting in the way? Are you ready to work on these? Do you just want emotional support?
Right. Right.
Instead of actional
It's a
change?
good question. Yeah. Good question. Yeah. Yeah. So let's talk about records then, because this is something that we have to talk about here. And there's a lot of issues about records that can be about medical errors. So what are records? They're chronicles of a dynamic psychotherapeutic relationship and are to be accorded the dignity and respect due such a relationship, is one definition there. And it's a summary of information derived from the psychotherapy. And all of us are psychotherapists, regardless of our license. I mean, that's what the title of chapter 491 is about. It's psychotherapy. So whether we're LMHCs or LCSWs or psychologists, well, psychologists are 490, but MFTs, then we're all psychotherapists there. This is what the law says a psychotherapy record must contain in Florida. Now, this may not be the same in other states, but, and this has been talked about by the board. I was at a board meeting when they spent hours talking about this and did they want to change it? And they decided, no, they want to leave it just as it was. So it has to have identifying basic information. Now, this goes into telehealth. How do you verify, if you're only doing telehealth, that the person is the person that they tell you they are? For those that do telehealth, how do you verify that?
On the intake, I mean, I don't do the person, the office manager. She collects the information, and that also includes a photo ID.
Okay. So having a photo ID, yeah. Anybody else have other ideas? Okay. But we do need to know that the client is the person that they say they are, and their address and their telephone number. And of course, again, telehealth, as Richard has taught this a lot of times, telehealth, we need to know where the client is at the time, right, that we're doing the treatment with them. So where are you right now? And why do we need to know that?
Because we have to make a call.
If we have to make an emergency call, then we need to know where they are. Yeah. A diagnosis, if it's applicable, doesn't say you have to diagnose every client. If you are not of the belief that that's something that mental health professionals do, and you're not going to do it, you let people know that, then you don't bill insurance, for example. So diagnosis, if it's applicable, and then the financial transactions between therapist and client, fees assessed, fees collected. And I have seen people get in trouble for that with 491, where people were billing things. For example, a therapist who was telling a teenager, bring your friends. And they would have therapy for hours and hours and hours without any informed consent being signed by those parents, just so he could bill longer sessions and stuff. And to dad's account. Yeah, on that one, it was dad had an account. They had a payment on record or whatever. And so they were, yeah. A record shall also include notes or documentations of the client's consent to all aspects of treatment. So anything you do or anything you add to it. So if you're going to start with something and later say, well, I think we need to do EMDR, then you need to have documentation that you added that to the treatment. Maybe that wasn't there in the beginning. All client authorizations for release of information, any legal forms pertaining to the client, which would be like the release of information, but if there's any other legal forms, any documentation of any contact the therapist has with other professionals regarding. So going back to what Annalyn, you said about maybe you're referring to, I had a case just last month where I asked the client, would he sign a release so that I could talk to his urologist, because I felt it was necessary to, I knew the urologist for one, so I felt comfortable and I knew that he would talk to me, and I felt it was necessary for the psychotherapy treatment and before the client went in to see the person. And so that's an example there, but it may be the psychiatrist that you're referring to if you're going to give them information, or if it's substance abuse, or a teacher even, yeah, as Sandy says. Regardless of who pays for the services of the psychotherapist, the client is that individual who, by virtue of private consultation with the psychotherapist, has reason to expect that the individual's communication with the psychotherapist during that private consultation will remain confidential. So I tell people in Florida, we have good laws like this that help protect people's confidentiality. So if they assume, because it's psychotherapy, that every communication is going to be private and remain confidential, then that's part of the privacy and confidentiality that's there. So that needs to be in the record. So 491.0148, and it tells you just what we're talking about there, the minimum requirements. So there's a lot of things that you may put in your records that are not really required to be there. You may do it for your own purposes or treatment or whatever, but this is what the law actually says. And then it's also in the rules. So chapter 64B4-9.001, this gives that list of the things. And this is what the 491 board could have changed. They can't change the statute. Who can change the statute?
Legislature.
It has to be the legislators, yeah, and the governor's signature or override or whatever. But 64B4, any of the rules are the interpretation the board makes about carrying out the intent of the law. And so the rules are real important to look at. And as it tells you there, the things like we have to maintain for 7 years after the date of the last contact. How many of you have ever had somebody contact you and say, hey, blah, 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 after you hadn't seen them for 6 years? And you say, oh, crap, I've got to start over. The clock has to start over here. Make a note of whatever that was about, right? And
Yep.
if you retire, if you relocate or retire or terminate practice for whatever reason, then this is what it says about the records. This is what you have to do to deal with the records. Now, I think this is very outdated.
Very.
The newspaper thing. Nevertheless, that's what the law says for right now. It's what the rules say that we have to follow. And
I'm doing this right now because I had a colleague pass away and I'm holding her professional will. And in talking with the lawyer about doing this, it's been very arduous because it's, think about it, of greatest general circulation in the county in which the licensee practices. Well, nowadays, guess where we practice? The whole state. So I just, so you know, just to run it in the Tampa Bay Times for 2 counties for 3 weeks, this is a little tiny.
Primary. If that's the county of residence, then yes, that's what I would do. That's my opinion.
Right. But she actually did practice another. I mean, it was $340.
Oh.
It's
Oh,
really
really?
costly.
That's cheap. The one
You think
Sandy and I
that's
had
cheap?
to do. Sandy and I had to do the same thing for a colleague who died, who used to be on our board, the FAMFT board, Art Cleveland. And that was what, 4 years ago. And they wanted $1,300 for a small ad. And I said, no, we're not. So I negotiated a much cheaper one, but it was still like $400, $500. Yeah, like you're saying that. Yeah.
And she's a psychologist and it's twice. You have to do it.
You have to do it twice.
You have to do it twice. And it's something you might want to consider in your professional will, that you set some of assets aside for your family.
That's a good point. So the brother of Art Cleveland is the one who ended up reimbursing us for that, and also reimbursed us for the locked facility where we kept the records stored so that we could go over. We did have occasion when we had to go find some and give them to other providers or different reasons. And so that we were fortunate there because, yeah, keeping the records, and this is where the 2-year rule comes in instead of the 7-year rule. But
Right,
you
but
have to
then
do it.
now records are in EHRs for a lot of people. So you
Yeah,
have to keep that EHR open
yeah.
with whatever.
No, you can, you can, if you decide to leave the EHR, you can still save the chart.
Yeah, you can still access charts if you leave an EHR, and
Yeah.
those charts are forever.
Yeah.
So those
They
charts
don't
won't
get-
ever be.
they don't get deleted after 7 years, Cynthia?
Not
So-
with a lot of EHRs.
Yeah, you could save it and delete the EHR system. So it gives you like a PIN number if you want to access the file, or you can just print the records, put it in a file and then delete the electronic version that it's saved on.
Right.
Like I have therapy appointment, and the records are forever.
Ever. Yeah, I do too.
Okay.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. So yeah, on the next page there where this chapter 64 addresses it, for somebody that has died, what Annette's referring to is that you're supposed to put an ad for 4 consecutive weeks at the beginning, saying this person has died or retired, if you're retiring. And then you're supposed to do it after 2 years, at the point of 22 months, to give them 2 months notice that on this date, the records will be destroyed. They'll be shredded or whatever. And so that's the record, is unless it's been changed. I don't know that it's been changed. Yeah, Sandy asked the question, what happens if a person dies and none of this occurs? They're going to take their license, or what are they going to do? So,
Well, the lawyer we spoke to did say they can come. You should actually hold open for the family to protect themselves. They should hold open their professional liability for that. For psychologists, it's 2 years and
that's a good
months.
point. That's yeah. Yeah, that's a
Because they
good
could
point.
then go after the family.
Yeah. And this is something that I put in here because I've been told that there's misunderstanding about it, that there's some places in Florida where people are taught that you have to have 2 locks. That's not true. I had an attorney with AMFT research that. It just says that your records need to be locked. So that's all. It doesn't say there has to be 2 locks. Yeah, we used to tell people when I was at FSU, and we had the records because it was a clinic for the doctoral students, that you needed to write your notes within a certain period of time, because after like 4 days, you're just making up fiction, right? So there is a timeliness to that. Any other thoughts or questions about records, documentations?
I'm just afraid when she mentioned that they can come after your family. I mean, they have nothing, not that I'm worried, but I mean, technically the family has nothing to do with what the therapist did.
Well, but if they're the executor of the estate, or the person who is the nearest relative, there may be some liability that I think Annette's saying that.
If you don't keep your liability insurance up upon your, like if you died while you were actively still in practice, which is what happened.
Okay.
So if you close your practice and you transfer your clients and you're moving and relocating, there's, less liability, right? But because you've handled your clients. But so in this case, the family is keeping up the liability insurance. The executor of the personal will is handling it and keeping it going, because there's a lot of balls up in the air.
Right.
That's really
I work
interesting.
for an agency and they pretty much own the clients. So do I still have to worry about that? They keep the charts. Like if I leave, it's their client, their chart.
It was your work, though. I mean, I'm not trying to scare you. I mean, I don't
You're
know.
right
I
about
would,
that.
I always would,
I'm sorry,
Yeah.
Annette. I don't mean to cut you off. Go ahead.
well, I was just gonna say, I'm not trying to scare you, but my thought would be, and I'm not a lawyer, that it's still always your work. You did the therapy work, you wrote the notes. The agency isn't going to protect you. In fact, if they have a problem with anything you did, they're going to probably come after you too. So, I mean, just being careful and doing your best practices is,
Yeah.
I mean,
what
wise.
I'm-
I've never heard of any cases. Larry, you may have heard of more of these kind of things.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I don't
Well-
really have any, it doesn't mean I couldn't get sued. I'm not worried about getting
Yeah,
sued. but-
I'm just kind of like in regards to like the death, like I've never worried about that because the agency, yes, like I work for them, but like
Mhm.
it's very clear they own the charts, they own the EHR, they own everything. Like I'm, like a doctor works for the hospital, they
Right.
like
Right.
the hospital records are the hospitals. So I'm just saying like I've never worried because all of it belongs to my boss and the company.
Yeah.
Like, am
Yeah.
I still like, I don't know now, like
Well,
I've never wrote a
yeah,
will.
I
for my
worked.
job.
Yeah, I worked in medical practice for a while, and the records were the medical records of the physicians group. So I get where you're coming from, and Sandy's saying, that she thinks probably that's accurate. I suspect our responsibility would be to ensure that they do their due diligence, but legally, yeah, we're not
And
attorneys.
you do have the
Okay.
liability too, because
And you do want to have your own liability insurance. So
Oh,
that
I
if
do,
something
I do.
does happen,
I
yeah,
do.
yeah.
And I
But
would
if
think,
let's just say you're
Uh,
doing something bad as a practitioner and then you die, even if the agency owns the notes, you're still
Mhm.
liable for the bad thing you did as a practitioner,
Right, right. That's
whether
correct.
you
Yeah,
document
I
it
guess
or
like my
not.
concern was like, I figured if I died, the agency would deal with that and whatever they have to send out, that my husband wouldn't be the one having to put it in a newspaper. That's all. Like, that's why I'm like, oh.
If somebody's
Actually,
being,
I'm
if
not,
somebody's
the
being
professional
litigious,
will.
Stacy, go ahead.
if somebody's being litigious, they're going to
Right.
sue
Everybody.
your agency and your estate. So, yes.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah.
Edie,
Yeah.
you had something.
yeah, thank you. You're trying to jump in. My impression was, and because family is not going to have access to your records. I mean, I think one of the things that I've done is I have a fellow therapist, like your situation you were just talking about. I'm glad you had an attorney to give you more information. But I have a therapist who will have access to my files the same way as you all were doing, and then would handle all of that. But my family wouldn't actually. So it is interesting to hear a legal, look at it. My family wouldn't even know anything in terms of how to access that information because I've kept it so separate from them. So they are not involved in, I mean, I have a separate will that has to do with my business and I've left money in that will to cover the cost of those ads and the time that my colleague would end up spending in order to deal with all of that.
Yeah, that's what AAMFT, I know AAMFT recommends that you have a professional will to cover your work in addition to the will that covers the family and everything.
Right.
Yeah.
And then if there is a question of something that's litigious, I'm assuming that my representative is the one who's going to have access to the files, is going to, in fact, my consent form says, if anything were to happen to me, so-and-so will get your records. And you're agreeing that so-and-so will, get your records.
So you're
I'm not
informing.
around, right?
Yeah, you're informing that. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and until we go to everybody having digital records, which probably will be someday that'll be the case, then yeah, those are going to be some issues that we have to face. So there's one other big thing that we have to cover here. So let me get to that, and that is called root cause analysis. So root cause analysis, as defined by the Joint Commission, this is a medical thing, a process for identifying the basic or causal factors that underlie variation in performance, including the occurrence or possible occurrence of a sentinel event. So there's a YouTube video if you want to watch it. This is the link for that. That's not at all to do with therapists, but it is a good example of what root cause analysis means. And that is, it uses an example of factory workers. So factory workers find there's a spot of oil on the puddle of oil on the floor. So somebody says, why don't we just go clean it up? And root cause analysis says, don't do that. So why would you not do that?
Where's the oil coming from?
Right, because you want to get to the root of what is the real problem. And that does apply to not just factories, but to us. In the example in the video there on YouTube, he says, okay, they do a root cause analysis, they find out, and the standard there is to ask 5 whys. You know, why this, why that, why that, why that, why that. And the example was that they find that they have faulty equipment that's leaking oil. So if you just clean it up, that's not going to get at the real problem. The real problem is going to continue to be there, right? So you find out you have faulty equipment. Well, why do you have faulty equipment? Because it was cheaper. And people who made the decision decided that they were going to spend less money on the machines. Well, why did the people decide that? And you just keep going 5 whys. And so this is the example of what comes in when we do make an error, or we are trying to understand what goes on. And so like when I referenced my client who did hang himself, and I went in to look at that with an attorney, I was looking at, you know, why did this end up happening and we were not able to intervene? What did I do? What should I have done? Or did I do everything I should have done? And keep asking, well, I did this. Well, why did I do that? I did have an emergency contact. I did call the emergency contact, didn't answer. Should I have called back, you know, and left a second message? Should I have sent a well check? That sort of thing. I didn't send a well check because I had no evidence that he was imminently suicidal based on what he had told me. But the why is trying to get at the root cause of why something happens. Does that make sense? Okay. Yeah. And so that's just what the rest of these are about basically here. The asking why to determine what is the risk, what might have happened, what contributed, how can we tend to decrease the liability of such events, you know, all of these sort of things. And we see this every day. They're replacing sections of sidewalks in my neighborhood, one street over. They have more cones and more tape, yellow plastic tape around there, you know. And if they leave a machine or a truck or something that they're going to come back to the next day, they go to all that trouble to put stuff around it, right? We see every day people doing things to prevent that. And actually for Sandy and I, we've had experience many, many years ago with the niece of ours whose boyfriend ran off the road and hit one of those part machines and ended up with her having a broken neck. Now she recovered from it, fortunately, but that's the reason that they do all those things that they do. And they have to be park so many feet off the road, legally. All of those processes that are necessary there to reduce risk. So as you think about the work that we do, what do you think in the closing 6 minutes here? What do you think we can do to reduce risk? Any ideas that as you've gone through tonight, you've thought of, well, here's how maybe something that will reduce the risk that we have, or something I might consider?
I think identifying risks are important in being able to, sorry, I can't, I'm not thinking of the
Being
word.
able to reduce the risk, yeah.
In order to reduce the risk.
Right. Yeah, Annalyn.
I had never considered the idea of, even as a private practitioner, to have someone who would review my charts. To have, agencies do that. Well, they usually do it right before they're going to have an audit, but to do, some sort of periodic review of charts that would then have to be in the consent, like Edie has said, maybe it would be that same person who's going to handle my professional will carrying out thing, that they be reviewing my charts, not only from a risk standpoint, but also from a carrying on and disposition of the charts after kind of thing.
Yeah, quality analysis.
Yeah, that's good. Quality analysis, quality assurance.
That's a good idea.
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
Empowering registered interns is very important. I know a lot of registered interns received free supervision, and they were treated very poorly compared to how I did. I paid for supervision. So it took longer paying supervision versus getting free supervision. But if I wanted to refer out because I wasn't qualified, and my boss didn't want to, my qualified supervisor would say this is a requirement, versus my fellow registered interns, like their qualified supervisor was their boss and they had to keep cases, like to maintain their jobs in the agency, even though they weren't, OCD experienced or, things like that nature.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's good. That's really good. The one intern I have for licensure currently, she works at a large agency, and just a week ago, in supervision, she brought up that she had been pressured by her company. So the clinical director actually quit over a dispute involving whether a report should be made or not. And the person quit because the company, from the president down several layers of administration, said, no, if we have too many reports, that'll become a political issue.
Yeah.
And so we had a big session on your license is your license. You have to protect your license. They're not there to do that.
Yeah.
What else? Real quick. We got about 1 minute here.
Assessments, make sure that if you're giving people the PHQ-9, the GAD, and also these are the forms in I recommended, the suicide assessment, status form, and also the tracking as you meet with the person and how the symptoms are changing, how you're following up. So these things are out there, so you can keep doing assessments so you have it in your chart.
That's good. That's good. So it goes back to what one of my Capella interns said. Ask the agency, what is your procedure? What are your policies? They said, we don't have it. And you're saying, yeah, you need to have those things. Yeah. And that's good. Yeah. One more. Anybody else?
Keeping current. I think looking at statutes, you identified a whole bunch of them today. you know, having these kinds of, attending these kind of workshops, and keeping current so that, you know, it's in our awareness that, you know, things are changing with telehealth and with just how things are changing. So thank you for this presentation today. That was great.
And
Well,
have
thank you,
a
Dr.
professional
Stewart.
will. Can I add one? Have a professional will.
Have a professional will. Absolutely. Absolutely.
All right. Well, Larry, if you would stop the recording for me, and then
I just made you host.
you
so
may be the host. Thank you. All right. Well, then I can stop it myself.
yes, yes.
There we go.